Welcome. We're diving deep today into, well, arguably the ultimate challenge in human history. It's not just surviving a crisis, but mastering that moment of a rebirth, really. We're moving beyond just the conflicts themselves to explore that deep, almost primal human need for stability, for finding identity again, and the often painful process of forging some kind of legitimate social and political order when the old world's just gone.
Yeah, this is really a study in societal flux, isn't it? We've pulled together sources that cover huge spans of time and geography. I mean, from the actual physical collapse of Constantinople's walls to, Descartes trying to pin down certainty philosophically.
Huge range.
It is. And when these massive structures fall, whether they're literal walls or like belief systems, the chaos that follows forces new leaders and individuals, too, to create these powerful narrative, often brutal ones, actually, to redefine what home means, what self means, what legitimacy even is.
So our mission today is try and synthesize these really diverse accounts. We want to draw a coherent picture for you, something actionable maybe, about how societies handle that dangerous shift from disintegration back towards stability, and how individuals reclaim their own identity in the middle of all that upheaval.
Yeah, it means looking at both, the strategic failure of the old guard and the sometimes ambitious cruelty of the new order taking its place.
Okay, let's dig right in. Let's start with a really definitive, incredibly dramatic end to a 1,000-year era. Right, we begin with that seismic event, 1453, the fall of Constantinople. It's the dramatic end of the Constantinian system of Christian dominance in that part of the world, really symbolized by that final siege. And the sources give us such a visceral account of the final stand, don't they? Highlighting the emotional crisis alongside the strategic one.
Oh, absolutely. It was so much more than just a military defeat. It was the psychological end of the Byzantine Empire. And the siege, right away, it puts a spotlight on this profound leadership crisis, but also, interestingly, an incredible display of human fidelity.
You mean Emperor Constantine the Elder?
Exactly. He was advised, apparently quite strongly, to escape. Go to the Peloponnese, regroup, preserve the imperial line, keep alive the possibility of a comeback. But he refused.
And his words, they've really echoed through history, haven't they? They cemented his role as that final tragic figure.
They really did. His emotional response, it feels like a deliberate choice. He sacrificed strategic utility, if you like, for symbolic permanence. He said, how can I do this and leave the clergy, the churches of God, the empire, and all of the people? What will the world think of me, I pray tell me? No, my lords, no, I will die here with you.
Wow.
Yeah. The chroniclers even note he cried out in grief, and everyone there just wept in silence. That refusal to abandon his post, knowing the city was doomed, it forged this potent, ultimate narrative of sovereignty, even as the empire was literally collapsing around him. He chose his legend, essentially, over his life.
And the defense itself, beyond the emperor's choice, was just this marvel of desperation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
A collective effort against, frankly, overwhelming Ottoman technology. We often focus on the spectacle, those massive cannons.
Oh, the super guns.
Right.
Right.
But the defenders' response to those devastating stone balls, that's a fascinating detail. Practical engineering under just extreme stress.
It really speaks to the ingenuity you need when you're facing vastly superior force, doesn't it? The Ottomans were firing, maybe 120 massive stone shots a day at the Theodosian walls?
Incredible destructive power.
Totally. And the defenders figured out pretty quickly that just trying to patch up the masonry wasn't going to work. So they devised these makeshift, really practical solutions, an ad hoc defense using huge amounts of earthworks, stakes, timber, brushwood, even animal hides, basically to smother and neutralize the projectile.
So soft materials to absorb the shock.
Exactly. The soft yielding stuff would absorb the impact rather than letting the hard stone balls just shatter the older brickwork.
Which turned their defense into this constant, grueling engineering project.
Precisely. This required, as the sources say, incessant nocturnal labor. You had men and women from the city pouring out after dark, risking their lives under the cover of night, just carrying materials, rebuilding the defenses that had been smashed during the day.
So it wasn't just soldiers fighting on the walls.
No, it was the entire community, engaged in this shared, utterly exhausting effort just to survive, minute by minute. That detail really shows the last stand wasn't just about the emperor's grand rhetoric, it was also about the relentless, anonymous labor of every single citizen.
And then the legend of the emperor's own death. It gets wrapped up in that very chaos, doesn't it? The lack of a definitive burial, no confirmed body, it just elevates the story even further.
That uncertainty is absolutely key to the legend. The Greek accounts, generally, they paint this picture of him ripping off his imperial insignia, the things that marked him as emperor, and charging directly into the fray at the St. Romanus Gate where the walls were collapsing, dying like a common soldier.
So he just vanished into the fight.
Essentially. The fact that his body was never clearly identified, some versions claim his head was presented to Sultan Mehmet on a lance, others that he just died hidden in the melee. It means his physical death becomes almost secondary to the narrative of his disappearance. He didn't flee, he just dissolved into the defense. And that final, simple summary you find in the sources, the Emperor of Constantinople was killed, it carries so much more weight than a confirmed grave would. It symbolizes the absolute, total end of that political system.
Okay, so if that moment was the dramatic implosion of the old system, it was also, simultaneously, the violent, ambitious birth of the Ottoman successor state. What strikes me about that Ottoman shift is how quickly they seem to grasp that real power needs pageantry, needs ceremony, that governance had to transform, overnight.
That transformation is staggering, yeah. And it's crucial for understanding how legitimacy gets created out of conquest. The Ottomans, having literally just destroyed the Byzantine capital, immediately started adopting the ceremonial trappings of monarchy. And they were heavily influenced by the very culture they'd just overthrown. They were actively shedding that image of being, unlettered tribal chieftains.
So they weren't just taking the land, they were aggressively grabbing the historical narrative too.
Exactly right. Sultans started adopting these grand Persian titles like Padishah. But maybe the most telling thing is how Mehmet II styled himself the Sultan of Rome. The Sultan of Rome.
Sultan of Rome, that's bold.
It's incredibly bold.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just hubris, it was a profound political claim. They were positioning themselves as the legitimate, ongoing successors to the ancient Christian empire they'd just conquered. They needed to legitimize their rule over these vast, multi-ethnic populations they now controlled. And the fastest way to do that was to claim some kind of divine or historical inheritance, even if they had to, kind of fabricate the connection.
And Mehmet II himself, the conqueror, he seems like the embodiment of that sudden, necessary shift in character compared to his father, Murat II.
Oh, Mehmet was a totally different breed of ruler. His reign really ushered in that great distance between the ruler and the ruled. His father, Murat II, he still used the old Turkish title Bey, and apparently was surprisingly informal. There's a visiting monk who even noted that Murat had no special mark to distinguish him on his clothes or his horse, and he rarely ate or drank in public. It suggests he was maybe more accessible, popular in that older, traditional tribal leader sense.
So Murat was the accessible warlord, almost, while Mehmet became the cloistered, ceremonial monarch.
That's a good way to put it. Mehmet's court became highly formalized. Access to the Sultan was strictly regulated, and this was often driven by a very real historical fear of poison and assassination. That paranoia really ramped up after Murat was murdered back in 1389. And this created the whole trajectory towards that intensely secretive, almost hermetic world of the Topkapi Palace, with its high walls and elaborate rituals, all designed to separate the quasi-divine ruler from the common people. The crisis of sovereignty, the need to establish rule after conquest, it demanded this new, highly formalized and utterly detached kind of legitimacy built on awe and, frankly, terror.
And there's that strange historical footnote you mentioned, the possibility that Mehmet II himself had kind of complicated origins, maybe taken as a Western slave.
Yeah, it's a compelling little detail, isn't it? It speaks to how malleable identity could be in that imperial context. Some sources hint at the strange possibility that Mehmet might have actually been born a Christian, maybe Serbian or Macedonian, before being raised in the Ottoman tradition. Now, historically, is it solid ground? Probably shaky.
But politically?
Politically, it's dynamite. If it were true, it would just underscore how much of his imperial identity was manufactured rather than purely inherited, which would mean he'd have had to assert his Islamic and imperial legitimacy even more aggressively through all that ritual and separation. The transformation had to be absolute, undeniable.
It's a chilling reminder, isn't it? That in times of upheaval, the greatest threat can sometimes come disguised as salvation, and the new ruler has to prove their authority through distance, not familiarity. Okay, but while the Ottomans were creating stability through aggressive centralization and, cultural appropriation, history also warns us that even seemingly stable republics can self-destruct from the inside out. Let's step back a bit and look at the internal rot that was observed in classical antiquity long before 1453.
Yeah, looking at the Roman perspective, historians back then observed this progressive, really devastating degeneration of the political process itself. The actual mechanisms of the republic, the elections, the debates, the rule of law, they were gradually undermined until violence, literal clubs, and rioting effectively replaced the ballot box.
Which allowed a few powerful individuals to dominate.
Exactly. Generals, mostly, with immense personal wealth and loyal armies, came to dominate the state. This was a kind of slow-motion collapse, not a sudden siege. It just eroded the very meaning of citizenship over time.
It was a slow burn towards failure.
It really was, a sequence of tipping points leading towards dissolution. The culmination, of course, was Julius Caesar being made dictator for life. And then his assassination carried out, ironically, in the name of liberty, a desperate final attempt to restore a political order that was already defunct.
The irony is pretty stark.
It's profound. To save the Republic, they resorted to the very violence that had destroyed its foundations in the first place. It just demonstrates that internal stability depends on more than just having institutions. It requires the continuous fidelity, the buy-in of its elites to those processes.
And that idea that internal instability can actually be caused by success is brilliantly articulated by Thucydides, looking at the Athenian experience. He didn't just see revolt as a reaction to oppression. He saw it as an inherent danger of prosperity itself.
Thucydides was really dissecting political psychology there. He observed that great good fortune coming suddenly and unexpectedly tends to make a people insolent. That's hubris, basically, translated into political action. He argued that prosperity is actually harder to preserve than adversity is to stave off.
Because success breeds overconfidence.
Exactly. Overconfidence and impatience with authority. Success makes you think you can do anything, maybe that the rules don't apply anymore.
How did he apply that specifically to the Mytilenean revolt?
Well, he saw the revolt not as a justified rebellion, which would imply they were suffering under Athenian oppression, but as deliberate and wanton aggression. He points out they were already being treated with high honor. They had substantial independence within the Athenian lead.
So they weren't desperate.
No. Their decision to try and ruin the dominant power, Athens, wasn't a fight for survival. In his view, it was an act of political ingratitude born out of having too much power, too much good fortune. Thucydides' point is critical for us. Stability demands continuous vigilance and maybe a certain degree of humility. Otherwise, success itself can become the seed of destruction, eroding the moral basis of the whole political contract.
Okay, that transition from internal degradation brings us to a really crucial question. If political legitimacy in a place like Rome could dissolve into violence, other cultures seem to have actively built their legitimacy on violent ritual. Let's pivot sharply here to the assertion of authority through extreme, spectacular means in the Aztec world. It's almost a complete inversion of Western political thinking.
It really is. The sources make it clear that for the Aztec state centered in Tenochtitlan, violent ritual wasn't some unfortunate byproduct of war. It was the central mechanism for maintaining political and cosmological order. The entire system demanded constant, visible affirmation through these acts.
And we can see this etched in stone, literally, on things like the Tizoc stone.
The Tizoc stone is a magnificent piece of imperial propaganda, really. It shows the ruler, Tizoc, not just as a successful general, but dressed in the actual regalia of incredibly powerful deities like Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, and Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. The conquests depicted on that stone, they weren't just military campaigns in our sense. They were understood as ritual practices, specifically intended to secure Tenochtitlan and its ruler as the absolute center spatially and humanly of the entire known world.
So the sculpture itself is like a map of their universe.
In a way, yeah. It features the celestial roof, you see the solar disk and stars, and then the terrestrial level below, with upright blades and earth deity masks representing where humans suffer death. And right in between, you see the Mexico warriors, including Tizoc himself, physically grasping the scalp locks of the submitting deities of conquered towns.
Grabbing them by the hair.
Literally holding the conquered gods by the hair. It powerfully reinforces the idea that the ruler's military conquest was divinely mandated, cosmologically necessary for the sun to keep rising and the earth to remain stable.
And the great temple precinct in Tenochtitlan, that was the operational center for this ideology, where the spectacle of sacrifice reinforced the hierarchy through, well, sheer terror.
Absolutely. The scale is just hard to comprehend. The precinct contained over 80 structures, and the skull racks alone, the Zompantli, displaying thousands of heads of victims. They were a constant, unavoidable, visible reminder of imperial power. The details of the sacrifices themselves are chilling, precisely because they were so systematic and varied.
What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, men were thrown into sacred fires and burned. There was one specific ritual involving the sacrifice of a young woman who was chosen to impersonate the corn goddess, Chikomakodal, or Seven Snake. After her sacrifice, she was flayed, and then the fire priest would actually wear her skin in a ritual symbolizing rebirth and fertility.
Okay, but the hierarchy of violence is what really hammers home the political structure, right?
Hmm.
Certain acts were specifically reserved only for the elite.
Absolutely critical point. The consumption of certain sacrificial victims, for example, was strictly exclusive. These victims were cut up, cooked, sometimes with squash blossoms, and then eaten only by noblemen and high judges. The sources explicitly say, but not the common folk.
So it wasn't just mass cannibalism.
No, definitely not. It was a highly restricted elite ritual. It reinforced the ultimate power structure by signifying that only the ruling class had access to the most sacred, the most dangerous, and therefore the most potent forms of power and identity. Social cohesion was maintained partly by terror, yes, but also by carefully rationing access to the highest, most powerful religious acts.
Okay, if that's the extreme societal approach violence as a literal foundation of cosmic order, we can maybe compare it to the heroic context of the ancient Greeks. Here, the violence feels intensely personalized, centered on a single individual's rage, rather than a mass ritual for state maintenance.
That's a great contrast. It's the difference between, say, institutionalized violence and deeply passionate individual violence. In the Iliad, we see Zeus promising Achilles divine honor, Time. But achieving that honor requires this long, painful process. Zeus actually manipulates events, driving the Achaeans back to their ships, making them desperately need Achilles to return to the fight.
But Achilles only comes back after Patroclus is killed.
Exactly. It's that intensely personal, emotional blow, the death of his beloved comrade Patroclus at the hands of Hector, that triggers the hero's defining epic rage, his meanness. And that rage leads directly to his violent, almost animalistic killing of Hector.
So the reclamation of identity for Achilles, his purpose, his honor, his worth, it's achieved through this furious, divinely ordained act of personal revenge. And that act fundamentally changes the course of the war. His identity isn't defined by the state or some abstract ritual, but by his personal honor and his relationships.
It really shows two very different paths to regaining some kind of order after chaos, doesn't it? You have the Aztec path, where the state asserts its cosmic position through ritualized, largely impersonal violence against others. And then you have the Greek heroic path, where the individual reclaims his lost honor through deeply personal, passionate violence against the specific person who wronged him. Both paths rely on blood, ultimately, but the scale and the purpose feel almost inverted.
That distinction between state-mandated identity and personal reclamation feels really key as we shift now from collapsing empires and raging heroes to the much quieter, but maybe equally profound individual quest for freedom and self-definition. Frederick Douglass provides such a powerful example here.
Yeah, when the societal structures themselves are inherently oppressive, like slavery, the primary battle for the individual becomes reclaiming their basic personhood, achieving sovereignty over the self. Douglass himself viewed his departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation to go to Baltimore as the single most interesting event of his entire life. He called it the foundation for all his subsequent prosperity and freedom.
Why Baltimore specifically?
Because it took him out of that isolating rural existence of a field hand and put him into an urban environment, an environment where the possibility of knowledge, of community, actually existed. For him, it was the crucial turning point towards self-sovereignty, towards becoming his own person.
But the journey to claiming that identity, even just thinking about it, was filled with this deep psychological risk, wasn't it? A necessary paranoia, even when faced with what looked like kindness.
Absolutely. The world Douglass had to navigate was structured by immense codified treachery. He tells this story about a good Irishman and another man who advised him to run away, head north. They told him it was a shame to hold me as a slave. But what's chilling is Douglass's reaction.
He didn't trust them.
He couldn't afford to. He was forced to act as if he didn't understand what they were suggesting. He treated them with immense caution because, as he says, he feared they might be treacherous.
Why such deep mistrust, even of people seemingly offering help?
Because it was known that some white men would encourage slaves to attempt escape, only to then capture them and return them for the substantial reward money. The system itself monetized betrayal. This constant danger meant Douglass realized he couldn't rely on external help, no matter how sincere it might have seemed on the surface.
Which forced him onto his own path.
Exactly. It forced him to devise his own solitary strategy for self-liberation. And that led him to the crucial plan. Learn how to write his own pass, his own permission slip to freedom. His quest for identity had to begin with literacy and absolute self-reliance, because self-preservation demanded profound distrust of anyone associated with the power structure.
This individual search for certainty for a self that cannot be stolen brings us neatly, I think, to the ultimate philosophical basis for identity, the mind-body distinction proposed by René Descartes. He was searching for something immutable after the huge intellectual upheavals of his own time, the scientific revolution and religious wars.
Descartes' whole project, really, was to find a starting point of absolute certainty in a world where everything suddenly seemed subject to doubt. He wanted to define the real man, the essential core of identity that couldn't be taken away by any physical threat or political change. And this led him, famously, to cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The thinking self, the mind, is the primary, undeniable reality.
But he still needed to explain how that thinking self interacts with the physical body, right? Otherwise, like you said, we're just ghosts rattling around inside meat suits.
Right. That was the next crucial step. He argued that the human soul must be expressly created, a unique, singular entity. It couldn't merely be lodged in the human body exactly like a pilot in a ship who just steers from a distance without truly feeling the ship's state.
So the connection had to be deeper.
Much deeper. For the human experience to be authentic, for us to actually feel pain, hunger, pleasure, all those sensations and appetites, the soul must be joined and united more closely to the body than a mere pilot is to their vessel. It's this intimate, intrinsic union, he argued, that constitutes the real man.
But the necessity of making this sharp distinction, it went beyond just metaphysics, didn't it? It was critical for the moral and social stability of the post-feudal world he was living in.
Oh, absolutely vital. It was crucial for establishing not just philosophical identity, but also, very importantly, for countering atheism and the kind of moral nihilism that he saw as a threat. Descartes contended that brutes, animals, are destitute of reason. Their actions are merely nature which acts in them according to the disposition of their organs. They function mechanically, like a clock.
A controversial idea then and now.
Deeply controversial. But this radical distinction between humans possessing an indivisible reasoning soul and animals, seen as complex machines, was key to his whole ethical framework.
Why? Because if we're just complex clocks too, then nothing really matters.
Precisely. If there's no essential difference, no immortal soul, then our actions have no ultimate consequence. This philosophical certainty about the unique human soul leads naturally, for Descartes, to the judgment that the soul is immortal. And this belief, he argued, prevents feeble minds from concluding that after this life, humans have nothing more to hope for or fear than, as he put it, flies and ants.
So it underpins morality and social order.
Exactly. Without that certainty that an individual soul exists and its actions have eternal consequence, the entire moral fabric of society is threatened. For Descartes, political stability and individual identity were ultimately anchored in this immutable, God-given reason, distinguishing us absolutely from the merely mechanical world.
Okay, so whether stability is achieved through philosophical certainty or brutal ritual or the physical conquest of a new empire, the end goal is always the same: finding and maintaining some kind of sustained order. In this final section, let's look at some of the structural and moral systems societies invent to maintain loyalty and continuity. Maybe starting with the internal metrics we see in Confucian thought.
Yeah, Confucian philosophy offers a fundamentally different way of measuring a worthy identity compared to the Western traditions we've mostly discussed. It really centers on the figure of the scholar-apprentice, the shay. And this identity is built on deep internal accountability and moral fidelity rather than emphasizing military prowess or physical strength.
What specifically defines this shay figure? It sounds a bit like a code of honor.
It absolutely is a high code of conduct. A shay, according to Confucius, must conduct themselves with a sense of shame. This is the idea that failing to live up to moral standards brings this internal crippling dishonor. It's not about external punishment so much as internal judgment.
And crucially, how they act when away from oversight.
Yes, that's key. When they're sent to distant quarters, far from the central court, they must not disgrace the commission of their lord. This shows that, ideally, stability is maintained not primarily by surveillance or written contracts, but by this powerful, internalized moral gyroscope that dictates self-regulation even when you're completely out of sight of authority.
But how practical is that, really? This idea of a sense of shame, maintaining stability in a vast, inevitably messy imperial bureaucracy. compared to, say, a strict legal code like the Romans developed.
Well, that's always been the core tension in Confucian governance, hasn't it? It fundamentally presupposes that moral cultivation, shaping people from the inside out, is ultimately more effective for long-term stability than relying solely on external punishment. The system rewards fidelity on multiple levels, though. Below the ideal show, you have recognition for people praised by their family and clan for filial conduct, Jiao respect for parents and ancestors, and also those praised by their fellow villagers for being deferential to elders.
And the common thread connecting all of this.
The common thread is Dex always making good on one's word, being trustworthy. Confucius says that cultivating sense gets one close to appropriateness, to right conduct. So stability, in this view, is defined by relentless moral and social fidelity, ideally flowing from the bottom up, fostering a kind of self-policing culture of honor that's meant to complement rather than solely rely on the raw power of the emperor.
That focus on internal fidelity, on this moral compass, stands in pretty sharp contrast to some modern, very pragmatic attempts to restore order in truly chaotic, lawless environments. Let's shift gears completely and look at what criminologists have described as a civilizing offensive in, of all places, Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, this is a perfect modern counterpoint to that Confucian ideal, isn't it? The Anga people of Papua New Guinea experienced what's been called a profound decivilizing process after the country gained independence in 1975.
What happened?
Well, the abrupt change, combined with a real lack of state infrastructure and presence in the highlands, created this huge governance vacuum. Young men, particularly those unable to find jobs or purpose, started forming these rascal criminal gangs. And this led to rampages, tribal fighting escalated, just widespread chaos. The state itself was too weak, often too corrupt to maintain order externally.
So stability had to be reclaimed not by the state, but by the grassroots community itself. How did they do it? What were these interventions?
It was a very conscious, multi-pronged effort, apparently. You had church leaders using things like exuberant sports competitions, music events, and communal prayer meetings to actively lure young men away from gang life, giving them a new, alternative, sanctioned community identity.
Providing an alternative structure.
Exactly. And then you had tribal elders demonstrating this amazing modern adaptation. They started utilizing cell phones, which became widely available there around 2007, to form these rapid response units. They could quickly mobilize and rush to trouble spots before minor disputes could escalate into full-scale clan warfare.
Wow, using tech for traditional conflict resolution.
Yeah. And alongside that, local governments started restricting some of the activities seen as fueling the violence, like unregulated gambling and excessive alcohol consumption.
So this sounds less like instilling a deep moral code and more like strategic, almost tactical community management against chaos.
Yeah. I think that's fair. It was perhaps tactical moral engineering, and the results were apparently quite quantifiable. The sources point to a significant decline in killings in that region in the latter half of the 2000s. This success led some observers to the powerful conclusion that peace is a modern invention. Meaning it's not the natural state of affairs, it's something that has to be actively, deliberately, and often very ingeniously manufactured and maintained by communal effort, especially when the central state fails or is unable to impose order from above.
These efforts to reestablish order, whether through community action or state building, often rely heavily on foundational narratives, don't they? Stories of origin that define who a people are and establish their legitimate right to the land. Let's look briefly at the Inca.
The Inca foundational myth provides exactly that, an essential narrative of migration and destiny. The myth tells of a family, 4 brothers and 4 sisters, leaving the sacred site of Lake Titicaca and wandering for a long time until they finally found the site of the future capital, Cusco, probably around 1200 AD. And archaeological evidence generally backs up the historical reality of this migration.
But the migration story is just the start, right? The defining moment of legitimate establishment came later, during a profound political crisis, the attack by the Chanca people.
Ah, yes, this is where we see that single act of personal courage transforming tribal history into imperial destiny.
Tell us about that.
Well, the story goes that in 1438, when the Chanca launched this devastating attack, the reigning Inca leader and 3 of his sons actually fled in panic. But a younger son named Inca Kusiyupanqui refused to run. He stayed and fought with such ferocious bravery that the legend holds the very stones rose up to join the fray and fight alongside him.
The stones rose up.
It's an incredible image, isn't it? This single act of heroic fidelity, refusing to abandon his people in their darkest hour, it did 2 crucial things. First, it transformed what might have been just a provincial squabble into a victorious moment of foundation for the Inca state. And second, it completely redefined the ruling lineage, establishing Cusipanqui, who then took the name Pachacuti as the legitimate Inca sovereign. This victory really secured their political hegemony thereafter.
That successful dramatic defense, built on courage and maybe mythologized intervention, stands in really stark contrast to another immense Andean city, Tiwanaku. There, stability seems to have been defined not by market forces or heroic battles, but by intentional social engineering and symbolic control.
Tiwanaku presents this incredible sociological puzzle because unlike virtually every other major city we know about in Western, Asian, or African history, which relied heavily on trade, on markets, on exchange, Tiwanaku seems to have had no markets at all, no bazaars, no haggling, none of that. The entire flow of goods, food, resources, supplies appears to have been directed entirely by kin groups, by lineage, and by the central government.
So a citizen's identity, their livelihood, was completely dependent on their family connections and the state warehouse system.
That seems to be the picture, yes. Citizens either grew their own food or obtained it through their lineage distribution networks or from government warehouses. This strongly suggests the city's primary purpose wasn't commercial, it was purely symbolic. The urban core existed specifically, as one scholar put it, for symbolically concentrating the political and religious authority of the elite. It was like a giant, continuously operating ritual performance of state power.
And their use of decay. That's perhaps the most fascinating tactic for projecting authority. The idea that the city was deliberately kept partly in ruins.
Intentional ruins. Yeah, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? But it seems to have been a calculated strategy. Keeping parts of the city in a state of ruin served to project the authority of the deep past, providing a visible physical link to the foundation of the state, constantly reminding everyone of the antiquity and therefore the perceived stability of the ruling class.
While other parts were being built up.
Exactly. Simultaneously, other parts of the city were continuously enveloped in massive construction projects. These often involved canalizing materials from the older ruined monuments, which in turn testified to the state's continued wealth and vitality.
So it created this constant landscape of both collapse and creation happening at the same time.
That seems to be it. Completion, as one academic noted, might not even have been the main objective for some projects. The goal was perhaps this constant buzz of purposeful activity, visibly connecting the present wealth and vitality to the deep, authoritative past through this carefully engineered landscape of simultaneous construction and decay. This constant performance of organized effort directed entirely by the state was their stability. They managed decline and growth together to reinforce their unique, non-market-based social contract. #outro.
We have certainly journeyed through millennia today, haven't we? From the bloody, chaotic end of Byzantium to the intentionally constructed ruins of Tiwanaku. And the core takeaway feels remarkably consistent across all these examples. The reestablishment of order, whether it's political, societal, or deeply personal, is always a complex, dangerous, and often profoundly violent struggle. It seems to require this potent and often brutal mix of things. Fidelity, cunning, sometimes philosophical self-certainty, and always the ability to define or maybe redefine identity when those old structures are just gone.
Yeah, whether we're looking at an emperor making that final emotional stand in his ruined capital, or a slave like Frederick Douglass meticulously planning how to write his own destiny just to reclaim his basic personhood, or even a whole culture building intentional ruins to legitimize its rule. The fundamental struggle against chaos is constant. Humanity is continually fighting to define what constitutes legitimate authority and what makes for stable self. And the methods, as we've seen, can be extreme, from ritual sacrifice to the active manufacturing of peace, but the impulse seems always the same: to escape the void of disorder.
Which brings us full circle maybe to that ultimate moment of the Inca's rebirth. We saw their future hegemony was secured pretty quickly after Inca Yupanqui refused to run during that Chanca attack, fighting so bravely that legend insists the very stones rose up to join the fray. So, here's the final thought for you to take away. In our own modern efforts to restore political or social order, whether we try to do it through diplomacy or economics, or those grassroots civilizing offensives we talked about, is it rising up of the stones, that moment of profound, perhaps non-rational collective will or even violence? Is that a historical necessity? Or can order truly be restored purely through rational choice and consensus? That's really the fundamental question of legitimacy that every single civilization in every era has to answer for itself.